hear him preach. And I know I feel the same tonight. I'm thankful for what he's taught us, not just from the pulpit, but also just through his example in life. And we pray for him in what could be his closing days here upon this earth. We're talking about family. And the song we were just singing is so fitting, because if we want to have happy, harmonious, healthy homes, we need to ask, does Jesus live in our homes? Is he a present part of our family lives? I'm honored to be called a child of God. And I'm also honored to be the husband of Celicia and the father of Kason and Miranda and Veda. I'm thankful that God has answered many prayers on my behalf. When I was young, I thought about my future, and I'd pray about a godly wife. God blessed. And if I was fortunate enough to have children, if I was so blessed that I could have faithful children. And so I'm thankful to God tonight for the greatest blessing a man can know here on earth, and that's to have a good and godly family. And really, my wife and my children, they help make it a lot easier to preach these sermons that I'm preaching this week. A few years ago, the congregation where I preached, there were 2 new elders appointed, and those 2 elders that were appointed each had 2 children, teenagers, good young people. And I went to both sets of children, and I said, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for living a life that allows your dad to step into this important role. And so how thankful we are to see God-blessed homes. That's what we've been talking about. Making the family great again. That's what we need to accomplish more than anything else in our country. And I will say this, some of you, perhaps you didn't come from a Christian home. Maybe you're here and you have some bad memories of childhood and family life. I want to tell you this, it can become better. Those of you who are younger and maybe you say, there are a lot of things I saw at home that I didn't appreciate, I know weren't good. You can correct that in your home by turning to the Lord, seeking his face and his counsel. You can have the home God intends for everybody to have. So tonight we're turning our attention toward the relationship between parents and children. I want you to consider a couple of verses from Genesis, the 18th chapter. The main character in Genesis 18 is a man familiar to all of us. His name is Abraham. And I want you to notice in verse 17 of Genesis 18, the text says, and the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do? What is the Lord talking about? Well, in the context, there are 2 things under consideration. One thing is this. God's going to bless Abraham and Sarah in their old age with a child. This will be a child of promise. Also, in this immediate context, the Lord is also saying that he's going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah for their exceeding wickedness. And it is that which he wants to reveal to Abraham. That's what's under consideration in verse 17. Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. Listen to this. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of him. 3 primary points in our message tonight as we think about communication between parents and children. Number one, it's the word anticipation, rather. The word anticipation. Number two, the word realization. And then number three, the word expectation, all right? Anticipation, realization, and expectation. There is a realization that all faithful parents can know. There is anticipation for faithful parents. And there likewise is expectation for faithful parenting. Now let's consider for just a moment this idea of anticipation of faithful parents. God makes it clear throughout Scripture that parenting is not for the faint-hearted. It is not for those who are weak, for those who are immature, for those who are careless. There is no bigger responsibility that I know that belongs to a man and a woman who are husband and wife than the proper parenting of their children. God anticipated that Abraham would be a good father. God says, I know him. I know the kind of father he will be. I can place a child in the hands of Abraham and Sarah, and that child will be blessed. I know him. I've contemplated this passage many, many times, and I've thought, could God say that about me? When children were born into my home, did God have that confidence in me that he could say, I can place children in the hands of Barry Grider, and they'll do well because I know him. That's what God said about Abraham. He said, I know him. I can trust him. Unless God knows you and you know him, you're not really ready to be a parent. Because if we're going to be successful in what we do as parents, we need to know the Lord. There are many today who don't know the Lord. And as a result of this, they have abandoned their responsibility as parents. Oh, I understand that there are some parents today who have walked away from their children, left them behind with other family members. I realize that. That's shameful. But it's also true that there are husbands and wives who work hard to provide a living, to provide many pleasures for themselves and their children, but have neglected the spiritual. And that's a major problem likewise in our land and also in the church of our Lord. Homes collapse when the Lord is not present. And so in the sacredness of marriage, God says children are to be born, not outside of that relationship. Children are to be born in the marital union. Genesis 4:1, Adam knew his wife, and she conceived, and she brought forth Cain and Abel. And so marriage is a bond between a man and a woman. It is a commitment made for life. The number one priority of the relationship, as we've already discussed, is abiding companionship, but it is also for the addition of children into the world. These children are a gift from God. Some people choose not to have children because they say they can't have the things they want if they have a bunch of children. But I'd like to tell you, friends, that children don't make a rich man poor, they make a poor man rich. Because Psalm 127:3 says that children are an heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. And so I long for the heavenly home. That's the ultimate goal. But when I'm away from my home here on earth, I long for it, because the dearest on earth are there waiting for me. And I trust that you feel that also about your family. Somebody asked the question, when do you start planning to be a faithful parent? May I say this to young people in this audience tonight? Even if you are not married, but you contemplate such one day, when you go to God in prayer and ask that he bring to you a good and faithful husband or a good and faithful wife, whatever the case may be, just go ahead and also pray this prayer. And Lord, if you bless me one day with children, help me to be a faithful father. Help me to be a faithful mother. through the life that you live right now, may it be said that you're already preparing to be a faithful parent one day. God says, I know Abraham. I know the man that he is. Would God say that about you and me? Can he trust children to live in our homes? Will our children come to know God by living in our homes and by seeing the example that we set? I heard of a few boys who were talking one day, and they were bragging about their daddies, because the heroes of little boys are their dads. The father of children, that's their glory. The fathers of children, that's that in which these little boys and girls take pride. And so these little boys were talking about their daddies, and one said, my daddy knows an important political figure, and the other boy said, well, that's not anything. My daddy knows some sports figure. They turned to a third little boy, who does your daddy know? And that little boy said, my daddy knows God. Right? And I trust that our children could say to their friends, our daddy, he knows God. And so the anticipation of faithful parents. God knew Abraham. And he says, I know him. I know the kind of father he'll be. But let's move to another section, and a lengthier section in our message tonight, and that is the realization of faithful parents. Here's what God says is going to be realized in the life of Abraham. He says, I know Abraham, and he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him. I know Abraham, and I know the instruction that he's going to give to his children. Has God in his word given us a formula for success that will help us with our children? We're familiar with some passages that relate to child rearing, such as Proverbs 22:6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he shall not depart from it. Now, I realize that in that training also comes a receptive heart by a child. But sometimes I've heard it expressed this way. My wife and I, we taught our children. No doubt you did. But the text says more here than just teaching. The text says train them. And that's going to take a lot more work. That's going to be a lot more difficult. You see, young man may decide he wants to play football. He says he enjoys in the wintertime sitting in the locker room and watching films when it's cold weather. But you and I both know that a coach is not just going to show films to his high school football boys, but he's going to do something else. He's going to make them hit the weight room. He's going to make them run. He's going to make them put on the pads. They're going to have to go out and they're going to have to hit one another and get tough as they prepare to play in the fall. Teaching is not all that's involved, but also training. And the text says we are to be involved in the training of our children. Here's how Paul put it. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and in the admonition of the Lord. Ephesians 6:4. Some years ago, I wrote something for a publication, and I use this often when I'm talking about parent-child relationships. And I entitled this, Don't Exasperate Your Children. I titled it, Don't Exasperate Your Children, because that's what Paul is talking about in Ephesians 6:4. Don't be overly burdensome to your children in the sense that you're so hard they cannot live up to your expectations. Guide them, train them, discipline them, but make sure that you do not exasperate them. And so I thought about this. How is it that we can exasperate our children? Here's what I discovered. When we don't give them time, we weary our children. When it's always later. When we refuse to understand, we exasperate our children. When we lay down rules and we don't explain, Now, sometimes I realize that a child will wear you down by asking why. And yes, sometimes it's all right for a parent to say what I always heard, because I said so, because that establishes authority. But many times we need to lay down the rules and also instruct during that time. Here is why we're doing what we're doing. Number 5, when we act like children and not parents, that wearies our children. When we don't provide the security of a stable home, when we never give them a break, never say they do anything right, through improper discipline, and by expecting them to be miniature adults, we can destroy the hearts of our children. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and in the admonition of the Lord. So let's think about that for just a moment. What does it take? What does it mean to train a young person in the Lord? I want you to go with me over to Deuteronomy chapter 6, and I want you to notice how that love is a priority in the home. Children need to know they are loved, and that must be communicated. That is foundational. This is an interesting context here. The Shema section of the Old Testament Scriptures. And here is the word of the Lord. Hear, O Israel, verse 4. The Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. Unless I have come to an understanding of the love of God, it's going to be very difficult for me to demonstrate a loving father before my children. You see, if we call God in heaven our Father, and children know their dads as being earthly fathers, the first concept they'll have of God the Father is what they see in those of us who are fathers here on earth. And so we love because He first loved us, 1 John 4:19. And therefore, if I want to be a successful father, and you want to be a successful father, if as parents we want to do our job, we've got to saturate our homes with love, and love comes from God. And so, I have said this many times. I would like to think when it's the hour of my departure, and when a funeral service is planned for me, maybe my son could stand before an audience like this, and on behalf of his sisters, himself, say this: the same man that you saw in the pulpit, that's the man we saw at home. You see how disappointing for children who see one thing at home and then something else outside the home. And so love is a priority. It is foundational. But how do we demonstrate love? We demonstrate love through conversation, don't we? Remember a text I gave you last night, Proverbs 15:28? The righteous studieth to answer. Those of us who are parents have to be very, very careful by the words that we use, because we can scar a child for life if we're not careful. There are a lot of people tonight who are adults who are still haunted by the words they heard, even from well-intentioned parents, when they were very, very young. Our words must be loving. And what does that mean? When our words are loving, that means that, first of all, we're not afraid of that little phrase, I love you. That ought to be spoken by moms and dads, not only to one another, but also to their children. Our words need to be encouraging. Who else can encourage like a mom and a dad? I don't know of anyone who can encourage like a mom and a dad. I heard the story of a boy who was struggling in school. And so it is that he brought home his report card, and he was very, very, very nervous as he gave the report card to his mother. She knew that he was having difficulties. She also knew that he was trying. She looked at the report card, and indeed there were some poor grades on that report card, but she noticed this: there was an A in writing. The very first thing she said was this. She said, I am sure that you're going to grow up and be a great writer one day. Will a child like that be encouraged to do better? Does that child hear from his mother something that motivates him to do well? Here's a mama who made it clear to her son God didn't make any junk, and therefore she was extolling those things he could do and encourage him to do better. Our words need to show our interest. Our children sometimes will press us to do things with them that ordinarily we may not find interesting. But I have found when I have the proper attitude, I can enjoy those things that involve my children. And so we can demonstrate love in conversation. We can also demonstrate love through consideration. It's easy to brush off a child. It's easy to say the teenager who lives in your home has some problems, but they're not as big as he or she thinks they are. While they may be molehills to us, they're mountains to the young person. And they need to know that we're concerned. Patience is the key here. When a little child, for example, disobeys and runs out into the middle of a street after you've told that child no, the child needs to be disciplined, because the child needs to understand that what he has just done is dangerous. When a child backtalks mom or dad, that child needs to be disciplined. But when little hands cannot grasp an adult's cup and milk is spilled, the child didn't mean to do it. But if our day's not gone well, we might vent on that child. And we have to be very, very careful, because we've got to exercise some patience in our dealing with these little ones. A 10-year-old boy said, grown-ups are always talking about what they did and what they knew when they were 10, but they never think about what it was like to be 10. And I guess sometimes we do forget. Here's something that I remember reading a long time ago, and maybe it'll be helpful to you tonight. This was written by Dorothy Law Nolte. It's been around a long time, but it's good. If a child lives with criticism, he learns to condemn. If a child lives with hostility, he learns to fight. If a child lives with fear, he learns to be apprehensive. If a child lives with jealousy, he learns to feel guilt. If a child lives with tolerance, he learns to be patient. If a child lives with encouragement, he learns to be confident. If a child lives with praise, he learns to be appreciative. If a child lives with acceptance, he learns to love. If a child lives with approval, he learns to like himself. If a child lives with recognition, he learns that it's good to have a goal. If a child lives with honesty, he learns what truth is. If a child lives with fairness, he learns justice. If a child lives with security, he learns to trust in himself and others. If a child lives with friendliness, he learns the world is a nice place in which to live. Oh, how our children need consideration, just like the rest of us. That's one way we demonstrate love. Another way we demonstrate love is through our commitment. Do you know what our children need to see as much as anything in the home? They need to see a mother and father who love each other. They need to see a mom and a dad who are committed to each other. Our children have come home at times in the past having heard of a friend whose parents are going through a bitter divorce. And it raises the ugly issue. We want to know if you will ever get a divorce. And we've had to reassure our children that that's just one word we took out of our vocabulary a long time ago. And so children need to know their parents are committed to one another. There is security in that. In fact, I have always wanted my children to see me embrace my wife, their mother. Before she was their mother, she's my wife. And I can remember when my children were young, I might be standing in the kitchen and give my wife a big hug and kiss her on the cheek, and one of those children would come over and try to get between the two of us. That ever happened to you? I'd pull that child back and I'd say, would you get out of here right now? I'm hugging your mother. Here's the reason I say that. Because I want my children to understand there is a relationship that is superior even to our relationship with them. Mom and Dad, we're together for life. The children, what I said Sunday, we're trying to get rid of them in the right kind of way. And so we're trying to prepare them for their own homes. I want them to see the commitment their mom and dad have made. And so I am not in any way going to allow them to disrespect their mother. I can recall on one occasion that I was with a group of Christians, and a teenage boy came upon the scene, and he was talking to his mother in a horrible fashion, disrespecting her, mouthing, sassing, whatever you want to say. Teenage boy. I'll never forget, as I was listening to this, that the daddy just stood there and did nothing. I lost some respect for that fella. And I want to make it clear in our household that the woman that my children call mom is also my wife. And they will not talk to my wife in a certain way. I demand that she be respected. And so these children need to learn these things. But then also, children need to know that we as parents are there for them. They need to know that. Have you ever heard a celebrity interviewed and somebody might be asked the question, the celebrity might be asked the question, you've got children now. With your busy schedule, how is it that you find time to spend with your children? And the celebrity might say something like this, well, we don't get to spend a lot of time together, but we believe quality is better than quantity. Child psychologists are now telling us what those of us who are Christians have known all along. Bible believers know this, that in the family, quantity is just as important as quality. I have said this before, and I mean it, that if my work as a preacher got to the point where it interfered with me being a good husband and father, then it's time for me to do something else. Because I believe that God has given me a responsibility first and foremost to take care of my family, to lead them on a path that will get them to heaven. Commitment means I have time for them. You remember Ephesians 5:16, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Therefore, children need our time. There was a man who came home from work one day. He was working long hours. Good man, a good father. He really wanted the best for his children. He came home and work was getting him down. He had a headache. When he walked in the door, his little boy said, Daddy, 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 I need to ask you a question. He says, not now, son. I've got a headache. I've had a rough day. And he says, but Daddy, Daddy, I've got to ask you this question. And the daddy said, son, I told you I don't have time. Go to your room right now. And the little boy walked away and went to his room. A little bit later, that daddy started thinking, you know, I shouldn't have talked to my little boy that way. He just wanted to ask me a question. He said, I'll go back to his room and I'll apologize. He goes back to his room, and the daddy said, son, I want to tell you I'm sorry the way I reacted when I came home, but Daddy's had a rough day. And I've been working really, really hard, and I'm sorry I reacted the way. You said you wanted to ask me a question. What is it? He said, well, yes, Daddy, I need to know, how much money do you make an hour? And the daddy said, what do you mean? That's your question? You want to know how much money that I make an hour? He said, yes, Daddy, I really need to know. And the daddy told him, said, well, here's how much money I make an hour. And the little boy goes over to his piggy bank and he starts taking out some money. A few dollar bills, some quarters, dimes, pennies. And he starts counting out the money he has. And finally he says, yes, I've got enough. And he goes over to his daddy and he says, Daddy, hold out your hand. And he puts that money in his dad's hand. And his daddy says, what is this? His son says, well, Daddy, this is how much money you make an hour. Can I buy an hour of your time? Hit that daddy hard. It hit any of us hard, right? What do these little boys and little girls want? They want a mom and dad who has time for them. Commitment means also that I care about their character. Children need to help us out here, particularly teenagers. And that is that we need to understand that mom and dad are in control of the home. 16-year-old boy says, well, Daddy's gone now, so I guess I'm the head of the house. No, you know what it means when it says the wife is to be in submission to her own husband? It also means she's second in command, all right? By the way, a young person, 12, 13, 14, 12, 13-year-old boy becomes a New Testament Christian. That's wonderful, but mom's still in charge at home when Daddy's not there. And as a young Christian, he'll honor that. And so we want to teach our young people something that is being missed in our world today, and that's called character. And character means discipline. Who does the Lord discipline? Hebrews 12:6, those he calls his children. And likewise, Hebrews 12:10, he does that we might be partakers of his holiness. What does that mean? That we can have character similar to his. And so what do Christian parents teach their children? Here's the life we've chosen to live, one that's approved by God, and we want you to know that too. And while you're here in our household, we expect you to live that way. And so it is that we discipline our children because we're interested in their character. You know, when we discipline our children, sometimes all you have to say is no, right? A good, firm no, yeah, that'll do a lot. Matter of fact, probably the best word you could use with a little baby as that little baby starts recognizing sounds is say this word over and over, no. It'll protect that baby. And then sometimes you have to go beyond that. Little child starts being able to walk around the house and having a good time getting into everything, but then he goes over there to that outlet. And he wants to put his fingers all over that electrical outlet, and you know that's not good. And what you might have to do, parent, is go over here and do something like that. And what have you done? Inflicted just a little bit of pain on that little boy or girl, just enough to get his or her attention. A scowl may come across the face, and all of a sudden a scream you've never heard before, but he'll get over it. He'll get over it. And then the next day what happens? That little child goes over there again and starts, but before he touches it, he looks back. He starts thinking, here's what happened yesterday. You might have to do it one or two more times, but he'll finally get the message. What are you doing? You're trying to help that little boy or little girl understand there are some things you just don't do. And there are consequences if you do them. And so none of us believe in abusing little children. But every one of us also knows that there's power in a good spanking. And I don't care what the modern child psychologists are telling us, good spanking won't hurt a child every once in a while. God gave a place on the lower backside to take care of certain matters. And parents do not need to discipline when they're angry. They don't need to be disciplining their children as a way to vent their own frustrations. But discipline means teaching. And therefore sometimes children, when they're young, need that. For our teens, and I love our teens, but teens still are expected to be obedient. Children, including teens, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. There's some things that are just right, and obeying your parents is one of those things. Sometimes parents have to take away privileges. Children don't like that, and especially teenagers don't. My teenagers now in my household, I'm through with the spanking process. That ended a long time ago. But I can still do this. You see that right there in your hands? Give it back to me. I pay the bill. You're not going to talk to me that way. You're not going to talk to your mother that way. You're not going to disobey what we say, so let me just take something that you think you've got to have, like this phone, and I'll just take it for a while. Well, they don't like that. They'll get over it. I pay the bill. And therefore, I expect my word and the word of their mothers to be honored while they're living with us. Discipline is important. We need to love our children enough that we're willing to do that. I never will forget that my daughter, when she was much younger, we were in a shopping mall, and I came upon one of these modern-day parents. It was a mother in this instance. It could have been a father, but it was a mother in this instance. And I mean, a little girl, the daughter of this woman, was lying outside of a store flat on the concrete or the tile or whatever it was, screaming and pitching a fit. And her mother was just hovering over her, patting her on the back, saying, "Go ahead, honey, get it out. Go ahead, it's going to be okay. You just go ahead and get that out." Now, I didn't say this, but I wanted to. I wanted to say, you know, I've got something right here I can take off if you'd like to use this. But I didn't say anything. It wasn't my place. It wasn't my child. But I did turn to my little girl as she held my hand, and I said this. I said, "Do you know what she needs?" My little girl looked up at me and said, "She needs a good spanking is what she needs." She'd learned. I never will forget, I was teaching about discipline in the home out in Texas a number of years ago. And I was talking about the need for disciplining our children. And sometimes for young folks that includes corporal punishment, or includes a spanking. And a wonderful elder out there, he had 2 college-age children living at home. He got up the next night, and he said, "I want to tell you what." He said, "I love that sermon Brother Grider preached last night on raising kids." He says, "I stand behind him 100%. He says, particularly, he says, on children needing to be disciplined today. He says, as a matter of fact, I went home and told my college students last night, I said, I don't know what you've done, but I'm taking my belt off tonight. I'm going to just give you a good spanking for old time's sake." I said, "I hope you really didn't do that." He said, "No, I didn't really do that." But he said, "I felt like it." If we love our children, we'll love them enough to discipline them. So children need to know we love them. And so when we engage in conversation, that's love speaking. Consideration is love showing. Commitment is love staying. Love is a priority. But then let me mention something else very quickly. We've talked about love being a priority in the home. But the home ought to be a place also where laughter is produced. Now I want to say something about joy in the home. Sometimes I'm afraid we get a little too serious at home. Let home be a place where you can relax. And let home be a place where you can enjoy one another. One man made life so miserable for his young people. His teenage son said that his dad was like a drill sergeant and he was ready to get an honorable discharge from his platoon, right? I don't know. But we've got to understand that there's nothing wrong with enjoying one another as family. The great poet Thackeray said, you know what laughter is? It's like the windows in a house. It lets the sunshine in. Indeed it does. I can recall on one occasion we were traveling from one particular place and our children were younger. And my son he wasn't, I don't think, deliberately trying to disobey me. He just wasn't thinking. The air conditioner was going strong. It's hot outside. But he kept hitting his button and the wind had come down. And then he'd push it back up again. I said, Casey, stop doing that. Oh, yes, sir, sorry. And a minute or two had passed, he'd hit it again. I said, I thought I told you to stop doing that. The air conditioner's on. I'm getting tired now of telling you twice to not do that. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. You know. 4 or 5 minutes passed. And sure enough, he hit that thing again. I said, I've had enough of this, Casey. I said, I'm telling you to stop doing this. If you don't stop, I'm going to stop this car. And it got quiet in that van. Nobody was saying anything to each other. Even my wife was sitting over there stone-faced. Nobody was saying anything. I guess I scared everybody. Well, I thought, what can I do? Now, my son, after 10, 15 minutes, I said, my son has learned a lesson. He's not doing that anymore. And I'd like to kind of lighten the air in this vehicle. What can I do to loosen everybody up now that I've engaged in the disciplinary process? So I thought about the fact that over here on my side, on my door, I had the control panels. And so at some point along there, I hit his button. His window comes down. And I'll never forget my son back there. Daddy, I didn't do it. I promise you I didn't do it, right? And everybody in the car had a good laugh over it, including me, including him. And therefore, we can use laughter in our homes to be a great means of providing joy and happiness if we'll learn how to use that effectively. Well, Making home a fun place, that's important. Now, our Lord loved children, didn't he? He placed them on his knee. I have no idea how many children engaged in conversation with the Lord, sat on his knee, talked to him, loved him. Sometimes I'll hold a little baby, but not for long, because that little child will see his mom or his dad and want to go back to them. I let them go quickly. But I have an idea that the Lord always kept little ones content. I was sitting up here tonight, and several young folks came down and just started talking to me. In those situations, what do? We just talk back to them. That's what the Lord does. Just engage in conversation with them. Brandon and Houston and others have had me in class, and I've told them before, when you stand in the back of an auditorium and you're greeting the crowd, I said there'll be somebody come along, they'll pull you on your pants leg, and it's just a little child wanting your attention. Don't ever dismiss that. Very, very special. They're very, very important. And so it is that our Lord loved children. In our homes, it needs to be a place where laughter is produced. But it also needs to be a place where the Lord is present. When I read this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 6, I'm reminded of how parents were to be creative in the way they taught their children. And likewise, they were to be reminded that there is no other God but one God. And so therefore, the Lord needs to be a welcome guest in our home. Think about that just for a moment. When you go home tonight and over the course of the next few days, I want you to think, would the Lord be welcome in my house? Would I be comfortable knowing He's here? He needs to be. His presence needs to be there. But if I really was cognizant of the fact that the Lord is here, I wonder what my response would be. Would I say I love you more often? Would I be more careful about the things that I say? Would I turn the television off more? Would I put my phone down? Would I behave myself in a different way if I was really recognizing that the Lord is here? What about when I discipline my children? I'll be very careful how I did that in front of the Lord. Would I talk about Him more? Abraham and Isaac, they were mentioned earlier. Isaac learned something about submission through his father, didn't he? Because when you get to Genesis 22, God has told Abraham to go to Mount Moriah and offer up Isaac as a sacrifice. Keep in mind that Isaac was a grown man, though a young man, he was grown. And no doubt in much better physical condition than that of his father. When he goes up the mountain with his father to worship, but he says to his father, he says, I see the fire and I see the wood, but where's the sacrifice? And no doubt with a heart that was palpitating and tears streaming down his face, Abraham says, the Lord will provide. Maybe that's when Isaac understood, I'm going to be the sacrifice. Isaac didn't run away, did he? And Isaac didn't overpower his father. But he went on up to the top of Mount Moriah, and in typical fashion of the Christ, he laid down his life. Because his father had taught him submission. His father had taught him how to worship. Anticipation of faithful parents. God says, I know Abraham. And then the realization of faithful parents. But then I want us to conclude by considering this point, and that is the expectation that comes to faithful parents. Because in this text, God says, I know Abraham. I know he'll command his children, his household after him. They shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of him. The Lord says, I want to bless Abraham. And I'll do this through this promised child. I want to leave a legacy behind, and I know you do as well. When I finish, I want to finish well. I know you do. And how can that happen? Well, I'm reminded that children are an heritage of the Lord. They also, in that same passage in Psalm 127, are like arrows in the hands of a mighty man. While children are at home, just like while the bow is, the arrows in the bow, you can control them. But what are you doing? As you pull back the bow, the archer knows he's got to aim for a certain direction. He's got to be very careful about his aim. So it is with our children. They are as arrows in the hand of a mighty man. What does our world need? Some godly children who grow into godly men, godly women. And we're responsible for that. We're the ones that can bring that about. Oh, that there was a heart in them, God says, Deuteronomy 5:29, that they would know me. And so it is that we recall how the faith that was found in Timothy likewise had been found in a grandmother, in a mother. It was passed on. And so I want to leave a legacy behind. You do too. How do we do that? Through the lives of our children. And so young parents particularly need to look beyond the here and now and ask, what do we want? And after these 2 nights that we've had together talking about communication between husbands and wives and communication between parents and children, here's something I want, and that is this. I would pray that God will bless me with the opportunity to grow old with my wife. Okay? Doesn't always happen, but that would be my prayer. May we grow old together, but let me go first. That's selfish, I guess, but that's how I'd want it. Grow old together. And may I live to be able to see not only my children marry and have children, my grandchildren, but even beyond that. What a blessing that would be. And may they all learn to love God. And may they all learn to love family. The first President Bush, who we sometimes call Bush 41, he passed away a few months ago. He was asked one time, what is your greatest accomplishment in life? Well, if anybody's ever examined the life of George Herbert Walker Bush, he would note that he was a Navy pilot, shot down, considered a hero. Likewise, he was a businessman. And I suppose that no one ever became President of the United States that had more political and governmental experience than he had. Well, he'd been a congressman. He was the chairman of his party, CIA director, ambassador to the United Nations, and then for 8 years, Ronald Reagan's vice president, and then he became president. And I guess the one who conducted the interview expected one of those things mentioned when asked, Mr. Bush, what's your greatest success in life? Here's how George Herbert Walker Bush answered the question. He said, my greatest success in life is this: the kids still come home. I thought that was powerful. The kids still come home. They still love their parents. They still want to see us. I remember it well. I was standing at the old Knight Arnold Church building, and the doors opened on that August day in 1996, and there she was, my bride. Up to that point in life, the most beautiful sight I'd ever beheld. She walked down the aisle and she became my wife. But it got better. Because a few years later, I was with her when she wasn't in that beautiful white wedding dress. She wasn't looking as pretty as she did on that day, but she was beautiful to me because she bore a son to me. But it got better. Later on, I have had 2 daughters. How special that was and is. But it got better because back several years ago, my son said to me, Daddy, I'm ready to be baptized. And I took him the same hour of the night. And in the watery grave of baptism, I immersed him into Christ. But it got better because my 2 daughters did the same thing. Now all 3 are Christians. And yet it's going to get better. Because I would pray that the Lord would so bless me that on my deathbed I could be surrounded by those I love so much. Maybe on that occasion my son could lead us in prayer. And I'll cross over Jordan. Only for it to get better. For I fully expect my wife to join me not long thereafter. And then one by one, my children and their families. And when I can stand with my family around the throne of my God, that's when I can say, everything for which I ever hoped, it has finally been realized. There is nothing that I know that is a bigger responsibility, nor more satisfying than being a part of a godly home. And therefore, that's why I enjoy coming to a place like this and upholding what God has designed for man's benefit. I trust you have that kind of home. But we can all do better. When we leave here tonight, may we be committed to our mates more than ever before, and to our children, to our grandchildren. May love be something that permeates throughout our homes. May it begin with each one of us individually. And so maybe somebody's here tonight who says, I want to recommit myself to the Lord because I want to make sure that I'm doing all I can for my family, for my home. Don't be ashamed to ask for a prayer like that. Maybe tonight somebody says, I've heard these messages and I realize how it's time for me to become a Christian. Either as a husband, father, wife, mother, grandparent, or maybe a responsible young person who says, now's the time. We can have great families. God's provided a way. That's what He wants for you. Don't be deceived by the culture all around us. He's given us a guidebook and we can follow it for healthy, happy, harmonious homes. And so tonight, think about these things. If you need to respond, won't you do it right now while together we stand?